Hello again everyone and welcome back to the Underground. Now that the Starlink Mini has been out and about for some period of time and the Starlink system has been used in a few different disasters around the country, I thought I would take some time today to kind of talk about the system, talk about some of the ways that you can integrate it a little bit more easily if you need it during a disaster situation. And perhaps most importantly, how you can leverage this as a tool alongside some of your other radio tools during a disaster situation, or even just more for everyday use. One of the common questions that's come out since the Starlink Mini in particular has been out on the market is, does this replace HF radio? Does this replace any kind of radio communications tools? And the short answer right up front is, yes and no. In some ways, it does replace some of the tools that we have grown used to over the years, but in other ways, it can't really replace some of the things that we rely on the most during disasters. So now that Starlink has been out on the market for a long time and has been used in disaster response for Hurricane Helene, most notably, again, also in Los Angeles now, and a few other localized disasters between these two incidents, one of the grand questions is, how does this affect radio, such as this one? This is a Xiegu G90, pretty standard man-pack arrangement, most popularized by the Tech Prepper. So this is a fairly industry standard now for using HF radio out in the field, just to kind of put it in this sort of pack like this and kind of go from there. As one might imagine, it's fairly challenging to compare a 1930s radio technology with the internet. So they're just apples and oranges, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about that, but we do need to address this right up front because I think a lot of people are probably going down the wrong path with regards to their choices during an emergency response situation. But just to get the ball rolling, let's talk about some of the things that Starlink brings to the table with regards to a disaster response. So one of the main things that Starlink brings to the table is that it's essentially an internet connection, right? Now, for the first time, essentially ever, most people have access, can have access to the internet via a satellite constellation, mostly anywhere in the world, for a very reasonable price. Of course, satellite internet in itself is not new. This has been around for a long period of time. Just Starlink is a new way of thinking about that sort of problem. As someone who's been a Viasat customer and using the old school HughesNet stuff even, this just does not hold a candle to any previously available satellite internet network. And because of this, a lot of people are just going straight to this in the world of disaster response, and they're kind of maybe not completely removing HF radio from the equation, but they're sidelining it a lot of times because this Starlink can bring so many other capabilities to the table that HF radio just can't do. For me, I prefer to use Starlink because really, in rural America, it's really all you've got. I have Starlink Residential for my home, and it is literally it. There's no 5G anywhere. Most of my area does not even have 4G, so I couldn't even use a Wi-Fi hotspot really any effectively. So it's really all we've got. And in cases like this on an everyday basis, Starlink has really been a godsend for rural America where the telecoms infrastructure just doesn't exist. Now, in terms of the actual Starlink Mini itself, we see this idea carrying forward when it comes to disaster response. People are just going to these, and they're sidestepping radio a lot of times, or more specifically HF radio, for some of their regional communications needs. And one of the things that Starlink in particular brings to the table that HF radio has been not so good with doing, and radio at large has not been very good with, is privacy and security. This has been something that has weighed on my mind since the Hurricane Helene response, and I think that it's something that the ham radio world really needs to reflect on and figure out, and that is the concept of privacy and security. Of course, when we're talking HF radio here, this is a public service, essentially. This is amateur radio. It has been granted permission to exist by the government, and unfortunately, anytime you're using, especially HF radio, you're using your FCC-approved call sign, which is linked to your real name, your real information, your mailing address, and that information is public, okay? So anyone can figure out everything there is to know about you just because you're trying to use an emergency tool. That is suboptimal on the best of days, but during an emergency it becomes a very big problem. So there's concerns for security on the side of the operator, okay? And there's also concerns on the side of the information itself. Once again, privacy doesn't exist on HF radio. It just doesn't. There's no such thing at the moment as encryption on HF radio. There are some ways of encrypting handheld radios. That's a lot easier to do. But when it comes to HF radios, to my knowledge, there aren't any yet. There will be, I'm sure. But right now, there's no such thing as encryption on HF radio in the civilian space. Now, why does this really matter, right? If you're during a disaster, do you really need privacy? Well, I think of two ways that came up during the Hurricane Helene response that I noted. And the first reason you might want privacy is casualty figures. Unfortunately, the ham radio community, for whatever reason, even the guys trained on this sort of thing, they do not have the concept of HIPAA or PII protection. Because the ham radio world has been open and free and nothing bad has happened to them yet, for whatever reason, most ham radio operators have no concept of privacy or data protection. These people will use their real names on the internet. They will, they just don't have any kind of concept of anonymity. Now, obviously, anonymity is a little bit important to me, but even if it's not totally anonymous, I really don't want to be talking about things that are very sensitive over the radio. For HF stuff, for region-wide communications, anything you say over HF radio is going to be picked up unless you're using some kind of privatized code that you create yourself. We can talk more about that in due time, but for right now, you have to realize that a secure Wi-Fi connection, an email, a phone call, something like that, is going to be a lot more private than blasting out information over the radio. For instance, you don't want everyone during the Helene situation locally was listening to the repeaters, right? They were even listening to these repeaters streaming over the internet. And a lot of private information, it just, it inevitably gets leaked. And it's something that you want to be mindful of. And this leads into the second thing, which is if someone knows that they're going to hop on their radio and you're going to talk about them over the radio for the whole world to see, and even streaming online, they may be less inclined to ask for help. So once again, something specific to the Hurricane Helene crisis response is initially the life, limb, property kind of emergencies, that got handled, okay? But as the disaster progressed, you noticed that about 2 to 3 weeks after the main, surge of aid into the region, there was another spike of people who needed help. And this continues even to this day, to be honest. Occasionally you'll see pretty big spikes. Well, what is this? This is people who waited, who were prepared. They were prepared to sit in their homes for 2 weeks. They were prepared to live out of their car for a period of time, but as time went on, they needed help. So they're not going to be first in line. Again, honor, integrity, dignity, discretion is part of disaster response. We may not think it is, but it is. So what you had is a lot of people who had no preparedness ability whatsoever. They were the first people in line for the Helene aid supplies, right? People who without generators, people without heaters, anything like that. They were the first in line, right? That's fine. We can learn the lesson of preparedness later on. But a couple of weeks afterwards, you had the people who were resisting. The people who did not want to be first in line, but they needed help, okay? And these people were monitoring the radio, and they were listening, and they were seeing all these people hit up the repeaters saying, hey, look, I need help. Here's my name and address. And they knew that people were going to be talking about this over the radio. So you had people who, again, I can't give you a specific example of this for privacy reasons, but also it's just a general theory of mine as well, that I think that there were a lot of people with the Helene response that did not ask for help because they knew their private information was going to be transmitted over the radio. And I think that if someone knew that you had a private email, or a private cell phone number or signal, okay, or some kind of private messenger, and they needed to contact a specific person that they knew was working the response, they could get the help they needed without advertising that they're vulnerable, okay? This is a huge thing. Call it pride, call it ego, whatever, but it's a huge thing in terms of disaster response. So I think that having Starlink and the ability to allow people to have more discretion with their disaster response helps a lot. Whereas if they know that Timmy's going to hop on the radio here and broadcast, their medical condition over the radio, they may be disinclined, or they may be a little bit hesitant to call for aid, again, because you're not talking about the people who initially surged in. You're talking about the people 2 to 3 weeks later, the smarter than the average bear people, but they still need some help. The people who wait 3 weeks to go get some help from a disaster, they're going to be smarter than the average bear, and they're going to be monitoring these radio things. So this has become kind of a thing since the disaster, right? We're going on a couple of months now, and it's just something that I've noticed. So having Starlink and the ability to have a little bit more private exchange of information helps quite a lot. Another series of reasons why you might want to consider Starlink in addition to the radio stuff you're working on is really kind of 3 main ideas. Commonality, the ease of use, and the ability to equip a large number of people all at once. For instance, starting with the last one, I can set this up, take it out of my backpack and set it up, and I can have a dozen people working off of this. I can set it up at a folding table, and I can put 5 or 6 people to work on one single folding table, working on all kinds of intelligent stuff. So I can set up a talk based around this one device right here. I could do that as well with HF radio, but it's going to be a little bit harder to do. It takes a lot of time. You got to figure out where the places where you're going to set up your radios are going to be heavily dependent on terrain, right? So this allows me to set up a talk in a little bit more using the space that I have access to, right? Guaranteed, you show up to a disaster zone, and guess what? People with more say and authority than you are going to have already picked the best spots for your antenna to be set up. So you show up with your fancy HF radio and find out, oh, that tree that I was going to use has already got more important people's antennas on it than me. So you don't want to be messing with that kind of stuff. You don't want to be adding to burdens, right? So if you're able to just pull this out, slap it on your backpack, or even just throw it anywhere on the ground, and you're able to operate, that's a huge factor that I think not a lot of ham guys think about a lot when it comes to integrating their radios. And of course, it's easy, right? It's a lot easier to use. Now, again, we're getting into the realm of comparing, apples to oranges kind of thing. So it's not really something that you can compare. This, you just plug in and throw on the ground. The HF radio, of course, needs the antennas, needs cables, all kinds of stuff, computers to run it, batteries, all this kind of thing. So in terms of actual personnel, I'm not going to trust a non-radio guy to put up my HF radio antenna. I'm just not. Whereas I can get any goober walking by to say, hey, throw this outside. It's a little bit easier to do. And, this is a factor that you really do have to plan for. Now, again, at the expense of saying, look, Starlink is just, the best thing since sliced bread, let's talk about some of the disadvantages, because there are a few. And a few of these reasons are why you can't get rid of your HF radio and just go to Starlink. So one of the main reasons why you can't just ditch your HF radio and go right to Starlink, if you are an HF radio guy and you're going to a disaster, one of the reasons why you may want to not really do that is fairly simple. Starlink is using somebody else's communications infrastructure. The whole point of HF radio, okay, the entire point of this is to have a truly off-grid experience, okay, just in case the grid totally goes down, okay. Think apocalyptic kind of scenarios to where the grid completely goes down. Now, unfortunately, the radio world, from the tactical guys in radio to the ham side of things, unfortunately, both sides have kind of the same problem, and that is risk assessment and risk mitigation, right? So we have to be mindful of the fact that at some point, the U.S. government can walk into Starlink's headquarters and say, at the end of a gun barrel, this is mine now. We're going to militarize Starlink, kick everybody else off except for these terminal numbers that we own. Of course, the same exact thing could have happened with, Iridium satellite phones. It's the same kind of idea. You're offloading your infrastructure to somebody else's infrastructure. So anytime that happens, if you, like I've said many times, if you don't own the wire, the physical medium that your communication is traveling through, okay, if you're relying on somebody else to string up a wire, or in this case, a satellite, you're going to be at the mercy of the people who did that, okay? So again, you do not own the Starlink constellation. You're just a customer, and they can cut you off at any moment. Now, how likely is that? Well, this gets into risk assessment, doesn't it? So one of the things that has really been a huge problem is risk aversion when it comes to communications. Now, me personally, I am going to use both of these tools. Okay, if I have access to them, I'm going to use them. The problem is that sometimes we may be tempted to rely on Starlink, and then our radio communications networks kind of take a back seat. And that's a little bit of a problem because, again, radio is a proficiency-based thing. This is a Wi-Fi router, okay? So you don't need any skill here, and it's a whole other system, whereas the HF radio stuff requires practice, requires dedication, all that kind of stuff. Another main reason that people might be very much against the inclusion of Starlink into their systems is they think that they're somehow on the front lines in the war in Ukraine. And this concept of risk assessment or improper risk assessment, or rather people assess the risk, then improperly factor in mitigation techniques. This being done improperly has resulted in some cultural things. For instance, how many times have you heard a radio expert say something, some kind of tactic, technique, procedure, some kind of radio or something will get you killed, right? How many times have you heard that? My ranting and raving on this topic was the first time I've actually, gone masked up for a video and things like that, because it's such a strong thing that I think people miss a lot of times. So when it comes to things that will get you killed, you have to understand that you're not in Ukraine, okay? You may be one day, you may be on the front lines in some kind of, war zone, but here's the deal. If I'm out trying to help people recover from a hurricane, I'm going to use the tools that I have, okay? With the full understanding that I'm not going to rely on this totally. If Starlink goes down right during the middle of Hurricane Helene recovery efforts, if Starlink went down, or if the government said no more Starlink for civilians or something like that, or the Chinese shot down all the thousands of satellites, okay? Fantasy land for a moment. If that happened, I could have gone to my HF radio, okay? Because I'm using both of these in conjunction with each other. So you have to remember where you are. So I'm not going to sit there and say tell soldiers to carry one of these on deployment, like with you. That's utterly insane. I guess unless you're a Navy chief and don't understand what Tempest means, this is going to be a very, very bad thing for soldiers stationed at military institutions or military bases overseas. Not good, right? If you're in a frontline trench in Ukraine, okay, yeah, this probably will get you killed because this is a Wi-Fi router, and it's communicating with satellites that can easily be detected, so your position is kind of given away. But are you in Ukraine, out here in Western North Carolina? No, you're not. If any kind of nation-state actor is at play and potentially targeting you, then this obviously isn't going to be the tool for you. However, by the time you get to that point, I think we're kind of in fantasy land. So one of the big problems that I have seen time and time again in the world of radio is people not understanding risk mitigation. They can assess the risk, okay? They can assess it just fine, but mitigating it, they can't understand. So all I'm trying to say is that if I have a radio guy who is so risk averse that he shows up to the Hurricane Helene, supply or food distribution center, and we need, pallets of water unloaded from this vehicle to this vehicle. And I say, hey, hop on, your Baofeng. I'll be, a couple of warehouses over, dealing with that. And he says, no, I'm not going to use my radio because of MCON, emissions control. The Russians are watching, or the NSA is tracking me. Like, I'm going to get somebody else to do the job. Because someone who shows up to a hurricane disaster relief thing thinking that they're on the front lines of Ukraine is not good. That's just too risk averse for me. I'm going to get somebody else to do the job. Now, that doesn't mean that we're going to just start using our tools willy-nilly like it's a completely permissive environment, right? We hear these terms on Reddit all the time, right? Permissive environment, non-permissive environment. This is the United States of America in 2025. We're in the middle of these two extremes. It's not entirely permissive, but it's not entirely non-permissive either. So when it comes to integrating Starlink in terms of security risks, emissions control, things like that, that's going to be on you to figure out. All I know is that if I need to contact people and maintain some level of communications with other people, and they don't have HF radio, I'm not going to be worried about the Russians dropping a munition on my head at this, current time for this current thing. So again, you're going to have an understanding of what your tools actually are used for. Now, again, when we start to slip into the more interesting times, I'll say, well, yeah, let's go back and let's start using, radio, more deliberate HF radio stuff that's a little bit more secure, right, or a little bit more conscientious of being direction found and things like that. But if I've got somebody out there who's concerned about somebody direction finding him while they're trying to chainsaw trees out of the road, I'm just going to get somebody else to do the job, because that's not the right environment. So when it comes to the cons of Starlink, that's pretty much it as far as I'm concerned, really. I'm sure there are others, and I'll talk about some minor ones in a minute. But the biggest ones that are going to be hard for people to kind of wrap their minds around are the fact that it's somebody else's wire, so it's somebody else's infrastructure. You're on the grid when you're using Starlink. The grid's just not on the terrestrial Earth. You have ground control stations, but you're getting internet. Even though the local grid may be down. So the grid still exists, you're just shifting it to space, right? So thing one, you're not off-grid when you're using Starlink. You're bringing the grid to you. You're shifting and using a different kind of grid. And two, emissions control, right? Obviously, if things get squirrely and you don't want people to know where you're at, Starlink's probably a bad tool for you. So basing your entire existence around an internet connection is probably not a good idea. That's why we need to still maintain radio tools as well. Now, some of the other cons are fairly minor, but I will mention them because it is important, I guess. First of all, Starlink isn't free, okay? You've got to pay the bill. It's basically a telecom's bill, so you can get different plans for these sorts of things depending on what your needs are. I personally, at the moment, use the roam plan, so I get 50 gigs of internet for $50 a month. But again, that's an extra bill, and a lot of people can't afford an extra $50 a month. But considering the alternative is to buy a several $1,000, HF radio rig, to me, the cost of that's kind of negligible, to be honest. But if you need it, you need it. If you don't, you don't. You can pause the service, so if things are getting a little tight and you need some leeway on that, and you want to have it around, but you don't want to actually use it as much, you can pause the service and things like that. And my plan is, since I'm going to be probably downloading more than 50 gigabytes of map data and satellite imagery during a crisis, my general plan is to use this. This is what I normally do day to day. Off and on, once or twice a week, I can download something, download some more satellite imagery. But during a crisis, I can upgrade. I can use this internet connection to upgrade to the bigger plan. That was like $165 plan or something like that, which is unlimited. So in terms of cost, it's not too bad, but it is something to factor in. Most people nowadays who might be benefiting from something like this, it's going to be hard to give, to float an extra $50 a month towards something like this. But again, that is a cost. The dish itself is, I think it retails for $600 right now, but you can frequently get it on sale, especially considering a lot of the retailers like Home Depot and some other hardware stores, they offer military discounts if you have that sort of thing. So you can get this pretty heavily discounted occasionally, several times during the year. Good luck finding a radio that's cheap. It's just not going to happen. So again, cost is something to factor in, so I thought I'd mention it. Another thing to factor in is battery power. What I prefer to use for battery power are these energy cubes. Again, this is just a fairly common power bank you can buy on Amazon. Fairly robust for what it is. It says it's 70,000 milliamp hours, which I think translates to, 259 watt hours. And in real world use, this exact power bank here, with moderate use on my Starlink, I can get about 6 hours. Now, if I'm downloading something heavy, or if I'm uploading content, upload's what burns it a lot more. Seems like to me. I don't know for sure, but if I'm uploading like a 4K video, we're talking about maybe 4 hours. Like that's the planning factor I would have for this. But that's something to consider. Whereas your HF radio is going to be able to run for a lot longer. So again, HF radio, this is a Zyuji 90 20 watt radio, so we're talking kind of comparable in terms of power usage, but this pulls so much less because of the duty cycle. It's not transmitting all of the time. This is. So you're gonna, if you're strapped for batteries, and this, of course, every disaster, batteries are a huge problem, right? So if you start getting low on your battery, Starlink gets unplugged, and we use that juice in the radio. So because the radio is more of an emergency tool in, say, a local area than, say, Starlink is. But again, it's kind of debatable, I guess. So, Starlink is a pretty good tool, right? I think this kind of has proven, especially the Hurricane Helene response, has proven that the need for Starlink is going to be around for a long period of time. And if nothing else, even if you don't see the use for Starlink now, you may at a later time, because here is something that a lot of the radio guys don't want to hear. And that is, a lot of the ham radio community, a lot of the guys using ham radios, they may not think they're intentionally doing it, but a lot of the times in the radio world, a technology is not preferred, it's not used, it's intentionally left out. Capabilities are intentionally degraded because people want to use their equipment, okay? You find this in a lot of other places too, but in the radio world, you show up to a disaster and you have needs, okay, and you have capabilities that you need to fill those needs. And the radio guys sometimes it's a swing and a miss because the radio guys don't want to modernize. They don't want to think of anything new. They just want to use the toys they got. And unfortunately, that's a problem. And that's even more of a problem if you show up to a disaster and all you've got is your HF radio. You can be an asset, you can make yourself useful, but you're also going to be, it's like bringing a horse and buggy, to a drag race. Everybody else is going to be using Starlink, so they're going to be wondering what you bring to the table. So the pressure is going to be on you more to provide more with your radio, because again, Starlink cannot fulfill all of the needs. Radio can be used to talk to people who may not have Starlinks in the local area, but again, Starlink has already started to put the pressure on HF radio to become relevant and become useful. And more importantly, it's put that pressure not on the radio technology itself, but on the operators. So operators are going to have to modernize and think of ways of becoming efficient because they've got a competitor now. So, that's something to keep in mind as we move forward. So what does Starlink replace? Well, it doesn't replace radios because radios have a use, even region-wide radios like this, because during the Hurricane Helene recovery efforts, people were coming from outside of handheld radio range. So a lot of people think disaster strikes, I'm going to be all good because I've got my Baofeng and, say, repeaters in the area. That's a good thing to have, okay? It's important, and it was very useful during this hurricane crisis. However, region-wide comms is important too, because the aircraft they're going to be bringing in supplies are not going to be within your region. So you may be talking to people 2 or 3 or 4 states over who are trying to help you in your area, especially when it comes to the flow of information. So that's why, this is kind of an important thing. Also, Western North Carolina in particular, not a high-income area, right? So not everybody's going to have the ability to shell out $600 plus $50 a month for a Starlink. They're just not. Even going forward, it's just not feasible for most people, I would think, who live in the area who need this kind of thing. So what can they do? Well, they can buy a $30, $40, $50 Baofeng and call it a day. So that's why these radio tools, you can talk from HF radio to HF radio, and that local HF radio operator can then tell the Baofeng guys what's coming in the region, all without Starlink. Now, again, Starlink will do this better, but the requirement is still there for radio. So again, Starlink is not going to replace this radio, but what will it replace? In my opinion, Starlink's going to put Iridium out of business. This satellite phone, I was paying at one point, I think $75 per month for 1 single hour of talk time. And that hour of talk time got broken up if I wanted to say a text message. So if it took me 15 seconds to send a text message, well then that would be 15 seconds off my 1 hour. And that was the plan that I had. And that was one of the cheapest legacy plans because I had this for many, many years. That's utterly ridiculous. You're talking high speed, 4K streaming capable kind of internet here. This is just not worth it anymore. So I can't put, like, the chances of where I'm going to need a satellite phone, but I also cannot bring this dish with me. Of course, the size comparison is a thing, but just in terms of cost, like, man, I'll eat that cost. This is $20 cheaper a month, and if it means I just got to carry an extra pound in my pack, I'll do it if it means I don't have to use this. So, again, I think that Starlink is going to kind of put the traditional satellite phone infrastructure out of business. And you kind of see this with Garmin kind of going the way of the dodo when a lot of these direct-to-cell satellite features start kicking in. We've still probably got a few more years left, but still, like, look, you know, this is way more worthwhile than your traditional satellite phone. So, you know, unless you absolutely positively know 100% of the time you're going to need this, but this will not do, unless you're that specific of a user, I would say just go with the Starlink. Like, if you're in the market for a satellite phone, you know, Starlink's probably a better option for you 99% of the time. So in terms of actually using Starlink alongside your radio, what does that look like? Well, I can tell you what it looks like very simply. Usually, you roll up to a static location, or say even operating out of a mobile vehicle. Starlink gets put up. Starlink forms the core of the talk because this Wi-Fi router can be used with a lot of the other tools I'll mention in a moment, software tools to enable collaboration and things like that. And that's the core of your talk. Now, you can get Starlink up and going. You can start getting the data feeds in, start downloads, start hooking people up with, you know, your password and things like that while you are setting up your HF radio if you're in a position where you can do that. Again, really, it's going to look a lot different depending on what your disaster response is, but I have found that having as many information sources as possible helps a lot. For instance, you can use HF radio to share information and reports from ham radio operators around the region. And the radio man who's running the HF radio can then send those reports out via the guys, you know, with Baofengs. Starlink can be used for data feeds, internet-based data feeds, and for region-wide communications, say like disaster briefings, higher-level command kind of things like that. So this is going to be useful for that. And both of these sources together, the radio side of things and the internet side of things, can be fused together, right, by an individual person, analyst, radio guy, whatever, and then the relevant information be packaged up and sent out via UHF, VHF radio, or even Meshtastic, right? Because this is an internet router, just to dip into Meshtastic a little bit, I know there's a lot of contention with it sometimes from amongst the traditional radio guys, but you can set up an MQTT server and basically have a Meshtastic device velcroed to the back of this, and now you've got global Meshtastic capability. See, that's very powerful if you start getting into that sort of thing, but we'll have to talk about that more specifically later on. Ideally, in a perfect world, in a perfect disaster response, everything that you do via radio can be done with Starlink, just better, right? And that way, if you come at it from that mindset, then that way, if you lose Starlink, either you run out of battery or some kind of malign action takes it down, you can then transition back to radio, right? Assuming and being okay with the degradation of capabilities. So that's just kind of the way that this works. You can take the bedrock of radio and have that be the way you normally do things. All the reports you'd push out, all the contacts, all the call signs and things like that you would normally talk to, well, you can talk to them the same way via Starlink, even like a video chat or something like that. But if Starlink goes down, you can transition back to radio very, very easily. That's why you don't want to rely on Starlink so much right now, because we're in this kind of weird transition space where it's still kind of a new thing, but it's going to become very powerful. But during a disaster response, you also don't want this to be your sole source of information. So that's why it's important to keep radio integrated, just because this may go down someday. So what are we going to use Starlink for specifically? Well, like I said, all the reports that you would normally exchange via radio can be done via Starlink, but there are a few things that you can't really do. Of course, we're not going to primarily be using Starlink to scroll Instagram. That's just not what we're going to be using it for. Most of the time, we're going to be using this for communications. And by that, I mean voice over IP, VoIP communications with people outside the region or up at a higher level of disaster response kind of thing. Or you're going to be using it for attending regional briefings. So just as a little, kind of a side note, you may be a radio guy, you may be working hard, cutting trees or something like that during a disaster response. Well, every day there's probably going to be a regional-wide briefing, either via Zoom or Microsoft Teams or something like that. And you may get a lot of information about where things are headed if you're able to tune into it. You see what I mean? So you may be able to have a lot more resources. Otherwise, you're going to be firing blind here with regards to the HF radio stuff. So you may want to, at the end of the day, tune into, say, the regional briefing, other briefings around the country, even mainstream media to see what mainstream media is talking about it, the crisis that you're currently working. These kinds of things really do help. And since I'm in the world of, information and intelligence processing, this is very, very, very handy, especially for dudes on the ground who have done nothing but listen to their Baofeng all day. They don't have that wider picture, that strategic picture. Normally, you would have to get that strategic picture via HF radio and just do the best you can. But as times have modernized, being able to tune in to, say, a FEMA briefing or something like that, or get the daily roll-up email, that's going to be very, very handy for determining how this progresses down the road. So another main use for Starlink is team collaboration. So this can be, because this is an internet connection, once again, I can set up Meshtastic and have an MQTT server going so that the local Meshtastic people in an area can then be captured by this Meshtastic that's hooked up to, say, a computer, right, that's connected to the internet, and that can be broadcast throughout, the MQTT servers I have set up, or even the public ones, really. So there's that, but you can also do things like TAC or ATAC instances. So you can set up a TAC server using this, and everybody that's out there in the field, as long as they're within radio range of your Wi-Fi router here, it doesn't have to be within Wi-Fi range, as long as it's radio range, they'll be able to have that information sync with a higher level server and managed from outside the zone. Another thing too is again, people outside of the zone are always looking for something to do. I can't tell you how many people who were not located in the disaster zone but contacted me wanting to help. That's a huge thing. And unfortunately, most of the time, when they're prior to Starlink, you just have to do the best you can with HF radio. Now, somebody could be sitting in London and typing a report for me, and an hour later, I check in at a certain time and turn my Starlink on at a certain time and download it, right? Very, very handy. The things you can do with the internet that you can't do with HF, again, it's just not worth comparing because it's just so much more. Another thing that a lot of the ham guys don't want to think about is specifically check-ins back at home. And what I mean by that is a lot of radio guys seem to forget that they're the only person in their family who knows how to use their HF radios. So say, for instance, somebody who lives in Raleigh, North Carolina, hears about the issues in their own state. They want to drive 5 or 6 hours away to go help. Fantastic. They take their HF radio and they get to a place where there's no comms. All they have is their HF radio to contact, the outside world. But their family back in Raleigh doesn't know how to use radio. So it would be, in a perfect world, okay to drive all the way out somewhere and use your HF radio to talk to your family back at home. But with HF radio, it's complicated and it's always expensive, right? So it's one of those things where you've got a radio guy who needs to use a cell phone network or hook up with Starlink, because he realized, oh, wait a minute, I haven't talked to my family all day and I was supposed to check in, but they don't have I have HF radio tools, they just can't receive it. So that's a huge thing that a lot of radio guys don't think about, is you're going to need to check back in with your family a lot of times. And a lot of times your families are not going to have the ability to use the same tools you do. So if you live in a family where that's a good thing, then fine. But that's not most people, I don't think. So Starlink allows you to do that a little bit easier. Send a text message, or some kind of email or something, so that your family doesn't have to worry about stringing up an antenna, in your backyard because you're 6 hours away, and the only way you have to communicate back to home is the radio. So something to keep in mind. So once again, Starlink's main use is going to be communications. Again, the same thing as we might use our radios for, just different audience, different use case. Another main use, for me at least, is mapping. More specifically, things like ArcGIS Online and other kinds of mapping platforms. I mentioned ATAC earlier, but that's more of a small team specific use. A lot of you are kind of familiar with the project I'm kind of working on right now, which is to use ArcGIS Online web maps to have a one-click, one-tap link to an online map that, as long as somebody has Wi-Fi access, such as with Starlink, they can view the map and see exactly what's going on in their area. They don't need to download an app. They don't need to download anything. They just need to go to the web browser on their phone and they can get to this. So that's one of the things that's going to be helpful. Again, ArcGIS Pro, for instance, if you start getting into the more heavy GIS mapping platforms, not everybody's going to get into this, but for me, it's really data heavy, okay? So you may get into an area and realize that you don't have enough data layers, you don't have the satellite imagery, you don't have the files you need, so you got to download them, and it's going to take 10, 15 gigabytes sometimes, depending on what the area is. In a perfect world, we could roll around with, 15, 16 terabyte hard drives, we wouldn't have to worry about this sort of thing. But if you're planning to go outside of your region, if the amount of data you may sometimes need is more than you can store. Or at least for me personally, it's more than I can store. But so that's why you may need a Starlink system to download imagery, satellite imagery for one, current satellite imagery, all kinds of intelligence products, things like that. So that's something that I use Starlink for heavily. It's, of course, ideal to have things both ways, so that, again, if Starlink's not available, I could still use GIS products to make maps on my own computers and then send that out to whoever I need locally without using the internet. Okay, that's fine, but you also have to remember that we're talking big stuff here, and in terms of most disasters, you're really going to have communication problems on a lower scale than you might think you would. Again, this gets kind of nerdy and stuff like that, but just know that for a lot of the mapping stuff that I do, so a lot of the intelligence products that I kind of create, I need to be able to download a lot of data that I can't really store ahead of time. Things like current satellite imagery or stuff like that are very, very important to the work that I do, which is why it's important to have on hand. Also, intelligence gathering. If that's something that you're kind of into and you're trying to figure out where disasters are at, Hurricane Helene, perfect example. A lot of the information came from Facebook, it wasn't coming via radio. A lot of it came via Facebook, so a lot of it via Twitter, social media pages, a lot of church websites, things like that. Baofeng's and HF radios and the radio side of things are great if you have a lot of people that know how to use them. But really, Facebook and social media is just going to be where you're going to get most of your intelligence collection during a lot of disasters, and that's just the way that it is. And relying on your own Starlink system is really good, so that you can reduce the demand for other people. One thing that kind of came up sometimes is people showing up to an area or showing up to, say, a Wi-Fi hotspot and not realizing that Starlink, as amazing as it is, it ain't fiber optic, right? So you get a dozen people on one of these bad boys and you're going to bog it down pretty good, especially if everybody's just frittering around on their phones, So these things are not perfect. The speeds, the internet speed out for me here in the middle of nowhere is pretty good. I'm okay with 30 megabits downloads, but somebody who's maybe used to living in a city with good fiber optic cable, they think, wow, I can do 1,000 times better than Starlink. Well, yeah, that's true, but remember, for me out here, there is no other option. It just doesn't exist. So in terms of reducing demand for resources, if I'm going to show up someplace and I'm going to be expected to go to work, they're going to give me a laptop, or I'm going to bring my own laptop and I'm going to plug into their networks and things like that and try to help where I can, I want to reduce the burden that I bring. okay? And if I'm going to sit there and say, hey guys, you mind if I use your Starlink to download 100 gigabytes of imagery? I don't want to be that guy, so I'd rather bring my own, and reduce the demand that I have on the system. You shouldn't show up as a prepared citizen to respond to a crisis and add to the crisis, right? So with all of that out of the way, let's talk about some of the more specific things you can do to integrate Starlink into your plan a little bit better. The first thing that you may want to do when you get any kind of, if you're using a Starlink Mini or even a bigger one, the main Starlink kind of thing, the very first thing you may want to do when you get it is take a label maker, ideally, or just a piece of tape if you don't have a label maker, and write down the network SSID and the password for this dish and stick it to the back, okay? Because especially if you're using a hidden network like I do. So I have this configured to be a hidden network. That way, when I show up to some place with 15 other Starlinks, my network isn't being broadcast out there. Now, of course, it is. So anybody with any kind of signals intelligence or SIGINT capability is obviously going to see my device. But people won't be able to try to access it, and they just won't even know that it's there. So a lot of times, I'm not trying to hide from the NSA, but if somebody like a poacher or something going through the woods, suddenly gets a notification on their phone, connect to a Wi-Fi hotspot. Yeah, that might be that might not be such a good idea, right? So I make mine a hidden network, and I write down the SSID and the password so that people who know to look for it, who are close to it, can find it. And it's one of those things that just kind of helps a little bit. Now, one of the other things that you may want to do when you get your Starlink and you kind of integrate it is change the power cable out, because it's going to come with this really long power cable that you don't really need, and this big wall wart. You're not going to probably power it from a wall wart out in the field, so I kind of leave that at home. Don't use that, and I instead have gone to one of these. Let's see if I can get it to focus here, which is simply the Starlink barrel connector with the little waterproofing rings there, and on the other end is just a USB-C power delivery cable. Now, all this does is this plugs in to the back of the Starlink Mini, like such. Plugs in, and it's weather resistant on this end now, so that I can put it outside my tent or on top of my tent, and then run the cable back down inside to my USB power delivery power bank, right? Very easy, common modification people are doing with these nowadays. Starlink is even started to, I think, sell these either now or at some point in the future, so that they don't have to use the wall wart kind of thing. So again, you can buy these. They're fairly cheap, and I just keep a couple hanging around. Now, one of the cool things about the Starlink Mini is that this cable here, this standard DC barrel connector, also fits my laptop. So if you have a Panasonic ecosystem of laptop, you can actually use the same power cable for your laptop for your Starlink. So again, my laptop here, I usually like to run this off of USB PD as well. So once again, just a standard barrel connector. This one doesn't have the waterproofing rings, so this is not going to make it waterproof, but it plugs in to my laptop to charge it via power bank, but it also works there too. So again, shared commonality. You only have to have one cable. And more importantly, if, say, for instance, where did it go? This cable here, it falls off, your Starlink falls off of something where it was perched and snaps off the USB end, which has happened before to me. If that happens, you have a backup, so you can still power your Starlink with a common cable. Speaking of falling off of things, one thing that I would very strongly recommend to use with any Starlink or keep kind of in your kit are cam straps. These are fairly common nowadays. You can buy these pretty much from anywhere. All they are just simple straps like this. These are, of course, the ubiquitous NRS strap. Anybody who's worked in kind of the wilderness kind of game, you know that NRS straps are kind of an industry standard in that regard. But I just keep a couple of the smaller 3-foot ones to attach the Starlink to things. So what I can do is, on the back here, run the strap through this thing here once it's kind of perched precariously on something, and then strap it down so the wind doesn't pick it up. This has happened quite a lot. You set this up on like a porch railing or something, wind immediately comes because it's essentially a sail, right? It's essentially a wing, and it'll catch the wind and flip it right off. It sounds stupid to focus on this so much, but this is such a desperately helpful thing. Of course, you could just use paracord or a bungee or something, but I like to use these because they're a little bit more sturdy. Same thing with your battery system. Now, this battery, like I have here, I've got a cam strap wrapped around it, but what I have done is I took just a smaller cam strap here. Let's see if I can get it to focus once again. I have taken one of these smaller cam straps and put some of the hook side of Velcro on this little piece, so that what I can do, take my battery here and Velcro it like such, and now I can take my battery that's going to be there with the Starlink, I can take that battery and strap that to whatever I need. So again, it sounds kind of stupid, but it really does help, especially if you're kind of moving around, you're finding out, well, you know, it just makes life a lot easier if you're kind of unequipped or ill-equipped to run your Starlink. Say you forgot your vehicle mount, like you didn't bring a magnetic vehicle mount, but you need to use this while you're going down the road. You can strap this to your roof, you can strap this to your roof, and the cable goes between, and it's fine. So again, focusing on mounting options is helpful. Like I said, you can get one of those magnetic vehicle mounts, which helps. If you know you're going to be operating out of a vehicle, bring it along. But for the most part, I find that just using the Starlink itself with some cam straps helps quite a bit. Sort of in a similar vein, if you wanted to be uber tactical, what you could do is sew yourself a mesh bag for your Starlink Mini. So let me just show you what this is all about. All it is a simple pouch, and what I can do is open this up and take off the little leg here and put the Starlink Mini in the pouch, which for once in my life I have actually sewn something that's the right size. So it goes in the sleeve like such, closes up, and there's your Starlink Mini. A little bit more camouflaged, and because it has these clips, you can clip this into, say, a pack lid, so it's sitting on top of your backpack, and then use the bungee straps here on the other side to strap it down, and you can run your power cable into that. So this is sitting on top of your pack, like on your pack lid, and getting the best signal that it can. Now, if I were to do this again, say for any gear manufacturers out there who are looking to make some of this kind of thing, I would probably use a lighter weight mesh. I was trying to go for a kind of a camouflage effect as well, so because obviously a 8.5 by 11 white rectangle out in the woods just kind of stands out, and this green mesh helps a little bit. But using a lighter weight mesh would degrade the signal less, and this does degrade the signal. It does, but again, since it's on the top of your pack, it's hard to figure out. Is the signal degraded because you're not at the proper angle, or is the signal degraded because there's mesh in front of it? I don't know. I haven't figured this out. I just know that I don't like to move around with this, like go backpacking through the backcountry with this on the top of my pack, because it just doesn't work that well. But your experiences may vary. It may get better once more satellites get up there. But I thought I would mention this because this is a solution that I have kind of come up with for now. But yeah, you can make it so that you don't even have to take if you were to make a slightly bigger pack, a slightly bigger pouch, you can make it so that you don't even have to take off the little kickstand here. But the kickstand is in my opinion, you can take it off, but I leave it on because it's not that much weight, and I've found that just from me using it statically, this thing is really weirdly shaped, so it's really hard. You would think you could just get a rock or something, right, and lean it up against that. Well, it doesn't really work that well. I've found that this thing will slip off of pretty much anything you put it on. So I don't know. Your experiences may vary, but I just kind of leave the kickstand on it and use it in its intended kind of angle for that. Batteries. Let's talk batteries. Again, I've been using this with my HF radio for a while now, for about a year actually. These little portable power stations, not this one specifically, this one just came out a few months ago, but I've been using the other ones with the cigarette lighter adapter here, and I just have the cigarette lighter plug on my HF radio, like so. And I know this is probably heresy in the world of radio, but I just plug it right in, turn it on, and I'm good to go. Like, I've tried to find ways of this not working, but it really does work. Now, of course, the cigarette lighter plug, you jostle it around, you'll lose the connection, your radio will turn off, and that's inconvenient. But, man, these portable power stations are super handy, especially considering the alternative. So the old way of powering HF radios is to use, like, LiFePO4 batteries, or what are now called LFP batteries, and they took forever to charge. So either you were trickle charging them via solar or not. These portable power stations, I can plug in to a generator. So if I come into camp or come into some kind of headquarters, wherever, some kind of supply depot, and they've got generators running, I can say, hey, you mind if I plug in and charge my stuff? And I'm like, yeah, fine. I plug right into a wall outlet, and in like 30 minutes, this bad boy's topped off, and I can just, move and go. Good luck charging a traditional ham radio battery that quickly. So these portable power stations are very crucial, and because they have multiple outlets, I can say, for instance, if I wanted to use one of these just kind of wall wart PD outlet things and plug that right into the wall outlet on the portable power station, and then I've got a couple of extra ports. Now, ideally, this is, again, an efficiency loss kind of thing. But again, disaster preparedness, it helps. It really does. So I don't want to be frittering around with some kind of homemade battery with a solar panel, a charge controller, wires going everywhere, all that kind of stuff. I just want something that works, and you pay a premium for it. It's going to be heavier, it's going to be more inefficient, and it's going to take up more space in your pack. But I'm willing to make that trade-off for some of these smaller power stations or some of these larger PD power banks. I'm willing to work with that, because this charges at, I think it charges at 100 watts. I may be wrong on that, but it charges fast. Same thing with this one. So you can charge these things really, really quickly and be out the door, especially from, say, like a generator or something like that. So I think that pretty much wraps things up. The Starlink system is something that's going to be around for a while. It's not going anywhere, and if you're wanting to use it a little bit more operationally, hopefully this stuff has helped. I know it's been kind of a long-winded way to talk about it, but most of the content out there on Starlink system so far is basically just, it's a cool thing, and that's basically it. But once you start using this a little bit more, you start using the tools that you have access to, you find that you have a lot more capabilities. And now, even if the lights are out, there's no cell phone towers or anything, I can sit there and have enterprise level mapping solutions, voice calls, higher level strategic kind of stuff. I can collaborate with anybody around the world, and that's really, really hard to turn down, even if it's not the best way of doing things 100% of the time. So hopefully this has been helpful for you in realizing the utility of being able to access the internet from anywhere, especially in off-grid environments, cheaply. And again, I hope to see a lot more of this being used in the future. But I also hope that we're able to take the challenges of radio and make some of these things a little bit more efficient in that regards as well. Again, it's a fine balance, isn't it? You want to rely on the tools that you have, but you don't want to over-rely on them just in case they fail. Same thing with radio, same thing with anything else. So, once again, I hope this is helpful in both showing that Starlink has a place, it's here for a while, it's going to be here to stay in terms of disaster response for a long time, but also that it doesn't replace radio. If anything, it replaces satellite phones, but for the most part, these tools can be used together in harmony, and they're definitely going to be very, very useful for many disasters to come. So once again, thank you for all of your support. Thank you guys for watching. We will see you next time. And as always, fight in the shade.